What are your responsibilities with regard to the school's strategic plan, and how do you know what progress is being made against it? In this video, we unpack the formulation and evaluation of the school's strategic plan and give you some pointers as to your duties as a trustee. The school may already have a strategic plan that's in place and is in the process of evaluating it. Or you may be in the phase of creating a new one. The strategic plan is something that's conducted periodically yet systematically informs the work of the school. As with everything, from defining learning to the best way to eat spaghetti, there are different approaches to strategic planning depending on what flavour you want. A board may create a 3, 5 or 10-year strategic plan, for example, typically 3 to 5 years. But the key takeaway is that it must be working hand in glove with the school's mission, vision and values. The vision and mission determine where are we going and what are we doing, and the strategic plan gives more concrete goals and objectives to get there. In turn, the strategic plan will inform even more detailed operational school-based plans that are written collaboratively with faculty and staff that are focused at the section or departmental levels. These operational plans are driven by the overarching strategic plan to move the school forward, but may be written with different audiences in mind, since they may be required for curriculum verification or accreditation purposes, as well as the level of detail required for staff to implement them. The work on the board on the strategic plan is to identify those areas of strategic or long-term importance rather than the operational issues. So that, for example, changing the choice of texts in Year 9 English isn't a strategic issue. It's not going to affect the long-term viability of the school. However, something like adding a charge for educational support or English as a second language support would certainly have a school-wide impact, since it may affect enrollment or change the dynamics within the school, change staffing levels, etc. Now let's pause to think about why we may want to have a strategic plan. I know it sounds a bit of an obvious question, but actually the planning process to know exactly what you plan to do is part of the equation. But like the tip of an iceberg above the water, the hidden part is in the ways in which it can help with change management. Organizational change management is incredibly complex. Let's face it, most of the time, people in the workplace, they often resist change. When you think about change management in a school, we have the 5 major stakeholders. The students, well, generally speaking, they're much more malleable and easy to be guided by the adults. We have the teaching staff, who are probably quite a diverse group, all highly qualified and experienced, and have done it in a certain way perhaps for many, many years. And while there will be some eager to change, many may unconsciously resist change. You have the support staff, who are likely in an international school to be much more homogeneous in their background and may not have the same insights into what is required for a successful international school. Then you have the parents who, in an international school, again are likely to be diverse, successful, well-educated, but whose agenda is probably driven by the immediate needs of the children. And then there's you, the board, who you know well and have the collective focus on the long-term success of the school, but have their own thoughts on what the school should be, what they should be doing to move itself forward. So the unspoken power of the strategic planning process is the potential to bring these stakeholder groups towards a common understanding of what the future looks like and the steps to achieve long-term success. Creating opportunities for dialogue and information sharing builds capacity for the strategic change. It shows all the stakeholders the roadmap that will take them to their destination. And this helps mentally prepare individuals so that the impending change is moving from a fearful unknown to an environment that can be envisaged and through repetition becomes familiar. Just think for a second why change is often resisted in the first place. The human brain has to process incomprehensible amounts of data just in everyday life, and the only way to be effective is for the brain to develop shortcuts, patterns, generalizations, and actually deleting a whole load of stuff. We rely on mental patterns and generalizations to save us the time and calories in evaluating and calculating absolutely everything. We can recognize the line sketch of a car instantly, and when we look out into the streets, we can see hundreds of cars, all different shapes, sizes, and colors. We make generalizations that those types of vehicles can all be classed as cars, and delete the unnecessary information about exactly which car was red or if it had a sticker on the bumper. While your brain has seen all of the different cars, the data is not important, and the brain has to delete unnecessary information in order to process everything at the rate that it needs to. The same is true for routines or patterns. We all develop habits or patterns, whether it's the certain way that you make your coffee in the morning or the drive to work. These create shortcuts for the brain so that it can expend less energy. Any time you force a change on someone, you may be making them change their habits and their generalizations, which then takes more brain energy, and so people often, unconsciously, resist change. So if I was told today, you're going to be put on a diet, Nick, you could probably imagine that I might have my reasons to resist. I don't really want it imposed on me without any say of my own in the matter, and maybe I like my eating patterns, and I'm quite happy with the status quo, and I could imagine that quite a few people would really resist the idea of being forced onto a diet. Let's face it, it sounds harsh. Maybe I'll have nothing to eat except lettuce or carrot, and I'll just be treated like a rabbit. You can see where my mind is taking me. Now, on the other hand, if I was told, listen, Nick, research tells us that people who spend a lot of time just working at a computer screen have a higher obesity and higher risk of heart attack. So we'd like your input in designing a schedule of exercise and diet so that we can come up with some delicious meals and low-calorie snacks. And within 3 months, you should feel as if you've got more energy and better concentration. So you get the idea. The way the message is delivered is completely different, and much more likely to get my buy-in. I can see that there will be a change. I understand that there may be 3 months, the short-term pain, but I'm going to be more invested in going along with it because I can see the long-term benefits and feel as if I've got a vested interest, I've got an input into the success. While the strategic direction and therefore the strategic plan is a function of the board, it doesn't mean that the board writes it in isolation. The strategic plan might typically be for a 3 or 5 year period with a regular review points. This significant document, therefore, would take some considerable effort on behalf of the trustees and the school leadership, with opportunities for consultation with the different stakeholders before and after the draft stages. The first step in preparing the strategic plan would be to conduct a thorough analysis of where the school is and where it wants to be in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, when taking into consideration the stated vision and mission of the school. The strategic plan is the mechanism by which the mission is going to be advanced, and if you're not being driven by the mission or vision, then what purpose do those statements have? You might want to go through a SWOT analysis to determine the school's strengths and weaknesses, the opportunities and threats. Equally, you may wish to invite stakeholder groups to consultation meetings to better understand from the parents, who are the customers, and the staff the perspectives of where they see the challenges and the future needs. These consultative meetings, of course, need to be handled with some forethought. Any time you're inviting stakeholder groups to discuss how they may envisage the school developing in the next 5 years, and perhaps doing some blue sky thinking, you run the risk of establishing expectations that maybe can't be met. But of course, now the cat's out of the bag, so to speak, and people may cite the fact that the issues had been discussed and that they may in their mind be convinced it was actually agreed by the board. So for example, let's say that parents express how important it is to build a swimming pool, or teachers complain that they're expected to have, new children in the class with zero English. And so they would want to have a basic English language induction before joining the mainstream classes. Having discussed the issues with trustees, it may set an expectation that these now will be prioritized on the plan with certainty, And so you'll need to ensure that there are sufficient caveats when opening and closing the meetings to ensure that people know that these are simply exploratory conversations at that stage. That no actual promises are made, but you're gathering the input from all of the stakeholders. You could also consider using surveys, since this would ensure that all of the stakeholders have the opportunity to contribute. An analysis of the results would give you very specific data to work with. So assuming that you've consulted widely and analysed the data available, you'd have some clear ideas about where you see the school at the moment and where you want it to be in the future and how you might close the gap. Now let's digress for a moment and think about the traditional business or military model of ready, aim, fire. When you have a stationary target, this model works well. You can do your analysis and define your target clearly and set a strategy to hit it. But we also have to take into consideration that we're now living in a highly competitive and potentially volatile world. Not long ago, you hadn't heard of COVID. And while you may have had some vague thoughts about SARS, COVID-19 has had such a massive impact on global economies and in turn your school and the way learning is taking place. Now think about the ways in which the school responded to the outbreak, to the changes in the way the schools had to close or implement social distancing or online learning. How did your school cope with this? How did it compare to other schools you know? In hindsight, what could have been done differently and what might have been the factors that inhibited the ways in which it adapted? This type of challenge requires an agile approach to leading the school through volatile and uncharted waters. Having a fixed mindset would have left schools struggling to make the square peg of a rigid school plan fit into the round hole, the changing dynamic of online learning, for example. So there are some organizations that think more in terms of ready, fire, aim as a means to take an iterative approach based on the continuous feedback loop, so that it's actually more like ready, fire, aim, fire, aim, fire, aim. It's also a bit confusing, as often the terms goals and objectives are used interchangeably, and some organizations define strategies before goals. There are lots of ways in which you can create your strategic plan, and you may have your own gurus that can help navigate you to a workable solution, which is great. However, if you're looking for how you can create or review your strategic plan for an international school, the usual funnel starts with a vision, the picture of where you're ultimately trying to take the school, which in turn helps to define the mission. From this, you may identify a few strategic goals which are broad, long-term aims that reflect the desired future point as described in the mission and vision. Ideally, you only want a few strategic goals, less than 5. If you have too many goals, then it gets very confusing for everyone in the school to focus on and to really keep them as a priority. Remember that these strategic goals are your big ideas that are going to move the school forward. So let's say, for example, that your goal is to improve parent engagement in their child's educational experiences and providing opportunities for constructive contributions to the school. Typically, you would then identify objectives for each of your goals. The objectives are more specific and measurable, and it's through monitoring these objectives and responding to feedback you can see the changes are being made. So, for example, in the case of the strategic goal to improve parent engagement in their child's education, you may set, let's say, 3 objectives. The first, to strengthen the use of, let's say, Seesaw in the primary school, such that every child has their portfolio viewed by a parent at least every week. Second, to foster support of parents as learning partners through student-led conferences where you would expect, let's say, 100% parent attendance. And third, to foster positive relationships and understanding through parent attendance at workshops and open days. Now, obviously, you'd spend time really crafting these objectives to make sure that they really do move the school's agenda forward. Of the 3 objectives, it would be most likely that the first one, to strengthen the use of, let's say, Seesaw in primary, would have come from the school's leadership. The other 2 objectives may have been driven by trustees or the leadership. Of course, for each of these objectives, it begs the question, how do you know? And that's where the measurability of the objectives comes into play. If we take, for example, the first objective, to strengthen the use of Seesaw in primary, the school's leadership would be able to get statistics, for example, from the platform about how many parents have engaged, So let's say currently you have 50% of parents logging in every week. That means now you have a way to measure and report by looking at the frequency of which parents log in and comment on their child's work. Now, that measure says nothing about the quality of the engagement or how it's actually impacting learning. So you really do need to be very thoughtful about what you're measuring. If we take the third objective, to foster positive relationships and understanding through attendance at workshops and open days, then this currently is lacking a specific measurable outcome. Again, asking the question, how would you know? You might want to ensure that the school leadership gather survey data from attendees at the workshops and through annual surveys to better understand how they perceive the value of the workshop in raising understanding and how, over time, the perceived relationships have changed. As you can see, this would take some thoughtfully worded survey questions to draw out this information, which could be further complicated depending on the parent's understanding of the language of the survey. As you are crafting these objectives and looking at possible ways to measure the school's success, it's always worth reflecting on the impact that they have. What is the impact on student learning through this objective? Sometimes it's not immediately obvious that some of the targets have appeared through various brainstorming activities and maybe make it to the final draft, but actually have no direct or indirect impact on student learning, which begs the question, why would you be making it a priority? The other thing to bear in mind is the pitfall of valuing what you measure rather than finding ways to measure what you truly value. It's easy to become fixated on those things that provide lots of measurable data, and it can give a disproportionate value. And remember that just because it's measurable doesn't make it better. There's a saying I quite like, weighing the pig doesn't make it fatter. Knowing the weight of a pig over time is an important measure for the farmer, for sure. But just because you measure it doesn't guarantee the pig will get fatter. It just gives a measure of the weight. And that's what it's what you do with the data that's important. So if a class gets 100% A grade on their examinations, GCSEs, whatever, what does that actually tell you? For sure, it's a great statistic to have to promote the school. But if it was a selective class, who would get that kind of grade irrespective of whether they were taught in a good school or taught by Mickey Mouse, it actually says nothing. Perhaps they should have all got an A star, or perhaps their initial assessment had them projected to achieve only a D grade. So now you're looking at more of a value added that the school has given. If you value, say happiness or kindness or confidence, and it's there as part of your mission and objectives, it's much harder to measure. To find measures of kindness in the school, you're likely to be looking for positive referrals or house points or surveys or the absence of bullying cases and so forth that might illustrate kindness in the school. So finding a measure for what you value is often much, much harder than putting a value to what you can measure. Finally, some schools go further to identify the strategies or tactics by which the objectives will be met. Sometimes these are planned as part of the strategic plan. Other times they're internal operational plans used by the leadership and staff. So for example, if the online platform Seesaw had been identified as one that needed to be strengthened within the community, then strategies as part of the short-term 12 to 18-month action plan might include running workshops for parents, professional development workshops for teachers, a communication strategy for promoting Seesaw through newsletters, guest speakers who use Seesaw to share their information, thereby encouraging parents to log in, etc. You get the idea. These would all be internal actions towards the strategic goal to improve parent engagement with their child's learning. Once the strategic plan has been crafted, approved and promulgated, there's a danger that it lays in a file on your computer gathering digital dust. The strategic plan, which itself is driven by the mission and vision, should feature regularly in the work of the board. While the measures that are put in place may not necessarily change a great deal from month to month, it doesn't mean that you ignore the goals. You might want to consider having a dashboard or perhaps a balanced scorecard to keep the driving data points regularly in view for your meetings. Having identified the strategic goals, then you can use these to help plan the annual calendar of the board and the terms of reference for the committees. Only through making sure that the goals and objectives are being addressed regularly will you be able to ensure actual progress towards them. To leave the plan until the end of the year review is simply not grasping the responsibilities of the board and the need to be proactive in its oversight of the school's development. When you reflect on your school's strategic plan, what jumps out at you? Are you able to identify with the objectives and your part in the process?